Milwaukee is a city shaped by water, labor, and repeated reinvention. It grew not from ancient stone or royal decree, but from shoreline, timber, and movement. Its history is quieter than older capitals, yet no less decisive. What began as a trading post became an industrial city within a single lifetime. Fires, floods, and economic shifts altered its shape again and again. By the late 19th century, Milwaukee stood at a turning point, no longer a frontier settlement, not yet a modern metropolis, but something in between, dense with ambition and uncertainty. This film uses AI reconstruction to bring that moment back into view. Historical photographs, maps, and written records are reassembled to show how the city once looked, moved, and sounded. Streets are rebuilt, shorelines restored, and buildings returned to their original form. If this quiet approach to history feels valuable, consider subscribing or leaving a comment to support future reconstructions. Before factories and smokestacks, Milwaukee was defined by geography. 3 rivers met Lake Michigan here, creating a natural harbor along a long freshwater coast. The land was flat and fertile, bordered by wetlands and forests. Native trails crossed the area long before European arrival. Early settlements formed near the river mouths, where goods could be moved inland or shipped across the lake. The town remained small for decades, its population counted in the hundreds rather than thousands. Compared to eastern cities, it was young and untested. Compared to frontier outposts farther west, it was unusually well positioned. As the 19th century progressed, that position began to matter. Immigration reshaped the city steadily and visibly. German settlers arrived in large numbers, bringing trades, language, and social customs that left a lasting mark. Poles, Irish, and Scandinavians followed. Streets were laid out in practical grids, expanding away from the rivers and the lake. Milwaukee did not grow upward at first. It spread outward, block by block, tied closely to the land beneath it. By the middle of the century, industry took hold. Lumber from Wisconsin forests flowed through the harbor. Grain moved east from farms and west toward growing cities. Railroads arrived and multiplied, connecting Milwaukee to Chicago and beyond. Factories appeared along the rivers, their walls close to the water for transport and power. The city's sound changed. Steam engines, sawmills, and freight yards replaced the quieter rhythm of carts and docks. The air grew heavier, the streets grew busier. In the 1870s and 1880s, Milwaukee expanded rapidly. Its population surged as work drew newcomers from across the Atlantic and from rural America. Housing filled entire districts with brick row homes and narrow streets. Breweries rose as major landmarks, their tall buildings visible from far across the city. Beer production became not just an industry, but an identity. Names painted on brick walls signaled stability and confidence. These were not temporary ventures, they were meant to last. The city at this time felt crowded and energetic. Horses pulled streetcars along fixed routes. Pedestrians filled sidewalks near markets and factories. The rivers carried both commerce and waste, reflecting the cost of growth. Public buildings appeared with greater intention. City Hall, schools, and libraries were built to suggest permanence. Architecture borrowed from European styles, but adapted to local materials and needs. Cream-colored brick became a defining feature, giving Milwaukee a distinct visual tone. By 1880, Milwaukee was no longer an experiment. It was a functioning industrial city with clear routines. Workdays began early. Bells marked shifts. Taverns filled in the evenings. Ethnic newspapers circulated widely, keeping communities informed and connected. Despite differences in language and origin, daily life followed shared patterns shaped by labor and season. Winters were long and demanding. Summers were brief and productive. The city moved according to these cycles. Yet beneath the surface, challenges were already present. Infrastructure struggled to keep pace with growth. Sanitation systems lagged behind population density. Fires remained a constant risk in tightly packed neighborhoods. Economic dependence on a few key industries made the city vulnerable to downturns. These issues were not always visible in promotional images or civic celebrations, but they shaped decisions quietly. As the 19th century drew toward its final decades, Milwaukee stood balanced between stability and change. Its foundations were set, but its future direction was not fixed. The shoreline, the rivers, and the rail lines had carried it this far. What followed would test whether this carefully built city could endure pressures beyond its control. The pressures arrived gradually rather than all at once. Economic cycles tightened and loosened, testing the city's resilience. Periods of growth were followed by slowdowns that left factories quiet and workers uncertain. Labor disputes became more common as industrial work intensified. Strikes and demonstrations appeared in public spaces, not as dramatic ruptures, but as signs of a city negotiating its own limits. Milwaukee remained productive, yet no longer effortless in its expansion. Urban density increased as land near factories filled completely. New arrivals settled farther from the center, extending streetcar lines outward. This created longer daily journeys and new patterns of movement. The city's physical footprint widened, while its core grew older and more crowded. Wooden structures were slowly replaced with brick, not only for durability, but for safety. Fires had already erased sections of the city in earlier decades. Each rebuilding carried lessons forward. Public health emerged as a growing concern. Waterways that once supported trade now carried pollution. Outbreaks of disease exposed weaknesses in infrastructure. In response, city planners and engineers began to rethink systems rather than simply extend them. Sewer projects, water treatment efforts, and street paving marked a shift from rapid expansion to controlled improvement. These changes were practical, not idealistic. They reflected necessity more than vision. As the city adapted, its identity became more defined. Milwaukee was no longer measured against eastern cities it once hoped to resemble. It was understood on its own terms. A working city, built by immigrants, sustained by manufacturing, and shaped by freshwater geography. Its architecture reflected this character. Functional buildings dominated, with ornament reserved for civic pride rather than excess. Churches, schools, and union halls anchored neighborhoods as reliably as factories did. The late 19th century also brought cultural consolidation. Music halls, theaters, and social clubs multiplied, particularly within immigrant communities. These spaces preserved language and tradition while slowly blending into a shared urban culture. Education expanded, with public schools becoming central to civic life. Literacy rates rose. Newspapers grew larger and more influential. Information moved faster across the city than ever before. Despite progress, uncertainty remained a constant presence. Technological change threatened established trades. National economic shifts reached Milwaukee through rail and telegraph. Decisions made far beyond the city's borders shaped local outcomes. Milwaukee responded not with sudden reinvention, but with incremental adjustment. It strengthened what it had already built rather than abandoning it. By the turn of the century, the city entered a new phase. Earlier improvisation gave way to planning. Earlier growth gave way to refinement. The foundations laid in the 1880s supported later transformations, including political reform movements and expanded public services. The city's industrial core remained, but its ambitions broadened beyond production alone. Looking back across this period, Milwaukee's story is not one of singular catastrophe or dramatic triumph. It is a record of steady construction, measured response, and quiet endurance. Shorelines were reshaped, streets were redrawn, generations adapted to conditions they did not choose but learned to manage. Today, the traces of that era remain visible. Brick buildings still line former factory corridors. Street grids preserve decisions made more than a century ago. Neighborhood boundaries echo patterns formed by early settlement and labor. The city carries its past not as a monument, but as a framework. Milwaukee did not become what it is through spectacle. It became what it is through accumulation, layer by layer, year by year. Its late 19th century form was neither beginning nor end, but a middle passage, a moment when possibility narrowed into structure. In this reconstruction, the city stands still for a brief moment. Smoke drifts upward, streetcars pass slowly, the lake remains unchanged. What follows belongs to another chapter. What remains is the evidence of how a modest settlement learned to become a lasting city.